Has anybody ever been to New York City and gotten a fake Rolex? New York City, you ever done that? I bought one for a friend one time. They don't like it when you ask them for a fake Rolex. They don't like that, okay? They call it a replica, I think. It's more like they're offended, and then they'll whisper, come back in 5 minutes. We'll get you one, okay? Yeah. That's what they said. When I was in New York several years ago, this was back in the day when Hard Rock Cafe T-shirts were popular. I got an imitation Hard Rock Cafe. Eventually, the sticker started peeling off of it. It wasn't real. But we're in this series, The Real Deal, and the theme, the tagline for our series is that we look for authenticity in a world filled with duplicity or with dishonesty or what is fake. And in an era where the virtual seems to be becoming more and more popular, people are having more and more experiences in the virtual world, even including how they relate to people. I think this is going to be even more and more true. We're hungering for what's real, what's authentic. And that's not just true in our everyday interactions. That's especially true when it comes to matters of religious belief or matters of faith. We could say if there's any area where we cannot tolerate what's fake, it's in matters of faith. If you are a person of religious conviction or of faith, and if you advertise yourself as such, you will be held to a higher standard. That includes those of us who are Christian leaders. Maybe you might say that's not fair, that someone would hold you to a higher standard than they would hold somebody else, but that's just the world that we live in, and maybe part of that is because of some of the high-profile failures that we've seen of Christian leaders. People love to point at people of faith and say that you're hypocritical in your standards, and that's all well and good. And maybe that's a good thing, that there's a certain amount of scrutiny that's there, because when it comes to matters of belief and matters of trust, all of these things are important. In fact, Jesus told us to scrutinize. He told us to be discerning in deciding what we believe about different people. He said in Matthew chapter 7, verse 15 and 16, he said, "Watch out for false prophets. They come to you in sheep's clothing, but inwardly they are ferocious wolves. By their fruit you will recognize them." In other words, it's not just by what someone says. It's not just by what they speak, the words that they use. In other words, we could say talk is cheap. People can say a lot of different things. But when it comes to discerning whether someone is the real deal or not, Jesus says, look at the fruit. Look at what's in their wake. Look at what is the product of their lives. Okay, what is their track record? In other words, talk is cheap, but actions speak. And Jesus can say this with conviction because people said the same things about Him. People scrutinized Him and they doubted Him and they called Him a charlatan and not the real deal, even a hypocrite, all kinds of different things. And Jesus demonstrated who He was, the bold claims that He made about Himself, the predictions that He made about the future, which He predicted some bold things, not just about Himself, but about all of Judaism, the entire Jewish religion. And as time passed, people could make their judgments as to whether or not Jesus was the real deal. Talk is cheap, but actions speak. On one occasion, Jesus and His disciples were leaving the temple in Jerusalem. The temple being the seat of religious power and of really the Jewish religion there in Jerusalem. A magnificent structure. There was nothing else like it in all the ancient world. It had been built in the 400s, 500 BC. King Herod, who lived just before the time and died just a couple years after Jesus was born, he added on to the temple, made it a magnificent structure. And on what was Jesus' last week before He was to be crucified, Jesus and His disciples were leaving the temple. It says in Matthew chapter 24, verse 1, and He was walking away with His disciples, and they came up to Him and they called His attention to the buildings. They said, "Don't you see these incredible structures? There's nothing else like this in all of Judea, in all of Israel, in all the Jewish faith." And Jesus is not impressed. He said, "Do you see all these things?" He makes a bold prediction about the future. He says, "Truly I tell you, not one stone here will be left on another. Every one will be thrown down." Now, for Jesus to say something this dramatic, this automatically gets their attention. I mean, without question. Jesus is not only not impressed with the structures of the temple of the Jewish traditions, Jesus said that they're going to be torn down. Not one stone left upon another. And so that immediately brings about the question from the disciples. The first chance they get when Jesus and his disciples, they walk across the Kidron Valley to the Mount of Olives on the east side of Jerusalem. Jesus is seated on the Mount of Olives. They're looking across. You can imagine them looking across, seeing the temple. I mean, it's right there. It's a beautiful setting to view the temple structures. And his disciples ask him a question in verse 3. They say to him privately, "Tell us, when will this happen? And what will be the sign of your coming and of the end of the age?" Because you see, Jesus' disciples believe what had become a popular stream of belief in the Jewish world at that time, mostly because of the prophetic writings, particularly of Daniel, also partly of Ezekiel and Isaiah. They believed that at the end of time, there was going to be a great battle. A battle between the forces of good and the forces of evil. And it would be in the midst of that battle that the Messiah would come, the anointed one. The ruler would come and he would set up his reign, his authority, his kingdom. He'd restore the throne of David. He'd wipe out all these pagan powers that had been ruling the Jewish people, the people of God who should be free. They were under kind of a new type of slavery to foreign powers. And so this king would set up his throne and the disciples would be right there. And they believed Jesus was the guy to do this. They believed he was that Messiah. He was that king. And so when Jesus starts talking about the temple being destroyed and not one stone left upon another, he must be talking about that battle. And so they say, "When will it happen, Jesus? When will it happen? When will it take place? And what will be the sign that it's about to happen?" Because they believe that when this happened, it would be the end. That would be when Jesus would come with power. His throne will be set up. He would reestablish the throne of David and Solomon in all of its glory. The end of the age. And so Jesus proceeds to answer their question. But he answers it differently than they expect. And in fact, in such a way that they're not even sure exactly what he's talking about. He begins to explain what will happen or what will bring about the destruction of the temple and the city of Jerusalem. He says that there's going to be these signs that you can watch for. There's going to be wars and rumors of wars. There's going to be distress unequal. There's going to be false prophets are going to arise. And all of these things. And then you're going to see something called the abomination of desolation, which was a clue that meant that there's going to be pagan armies surrounding the city. And when you see that, you need to run. You need to get out. And then Jesus told them in verse 34, "I tell you, this generation will certainly not pass away until all these things have happened." In other words, some of you who are alive, who are here today, you will live to see this happen. Some people who are alive, a generation, which in biblical terms, they perceived a generation to be about 40 years. So Jesus says that this is going to happen within this generation. So a lot of them are thinking, yeah, right, great. We're going to be right here. We're going to get to see Jesus coming with power. It's going to happen during our lifetimes. I mean, don't you all want that? You know, I mean, in a way you kind of don't want to, but in a way you kind of, it would be cool, you know. But then Jesus kind of throws a wrench into the way they think about things. Yeah, it's going to be in one generation that this is going to happen, but about the day of my coming and the end of the age, verse 36, about that day or hour no one knows, not even the angels in heaven nor the Son, but only the Father. There's going to be signs, just like a fig tree, it's about to produce fruit. There's going to be signs that the destruction of the temple is near and Jerusalem is near. But about that day, nobody knows. It's going to catch everyone off guard. And so here's what you should do. Here's what you should do in light of that. Verse 42. You should keep watch because you do not know on what day your Lord will come. You don't know, so you should always be ready. Well, 40 years passed. In the year 70 AD, perhaps 40 years exactly after Jesus spoke these words, the Roman army attacked Jerusalem, led by Titus, who was the son of the emperor. And they surrounded the city. And they besieged the city. And it was a horrible time. The people starved to death. The historian Josephus said that more than 1 million people died in the siege. But the Christians survived, or most of them at least. They got out of the city. They went across the Jordan River. There's historical evidence that they escaped to a place called Pella on the other side of the Jordan. And then they came back later because they believed that Jesus was the real deal. And so when Jesus said to get out, when you see this happening, they saw the signs, they obeyed, and they lived. They survived to tell about it. And then Jesus, begins to describe what's going to happen after this. He says, after this teaching, he tells 3 parables. One is a parable about a servant who's put in charge of his master's household. Another is about bridesmaids who are waiting on the arrival of a bridegroom, a wedding procession. It was different in that culture. You didn't know when the bridegroom would arrive, and that was their tradition in that particular day. And then a third parable about stewards or servants who are put in charge of their master's money. And their master comes back and he demands an accounting for how well they've done with the talents that he's given to them. The 3 parables. The parable of the servant in the household, the parable of the bridesmaids waiting for the wedding procession, and the parable of the talents. All parables about someone who's coming back again and catches some people off guard. Some people who aren't prepared. There's a theme to all of this. There's a theme to Jesus' teaching about His return, about that future day. Is that the best way to be ready for then, my coming and the end of the age, Jesus says? We will be ready then by prioritizing now. That's how you'll be ready. By doing what you should be doing now, today. And then Jesus wraps up this teaching with what some have called a parable, but it's actually not a parable. A parable, when Jesus teaches a parable, which is a story, which is a spiritual story, an earthly story with a spiritual meaning, Jesus uses the phrase "like." The kingdom of heaven is like this or like that. Jesus doesn't use it in this particular instance. But He does use illustrations or metaphors to describe what will happen when He returns. And it begins in verse 31 of Matthew chapter 25. Here's what Jesus says. It says, when the Son of Man comes in His glory, that's what they're waiting for. His return, His arrival, literally is what the Greek word there, parousia, means. When the Son of Man comes in His glory and all the angels with Him, He will sit on His glorious throne. That's what we're waiting for. That's what we're asking about, Jesus. That's what we want to know more about that. When it happens, all the nations will be gathered before Him. Now that's important. Because Jesus was a Jewish Messiah. He was the King of the Jews. And He's speaking about all the nations. That includes Jews and Gentiles. Basically that means all people who have ever lived gathered before Him. A vast multitude, no one can count, Billions of people. And here's what will happen. He will separate the people one from another as a shepherd separates the sheep from the goats. He will put the sheep on His right and the goats on His left. Now, in that day, sheep and goats, they were pastured together most of the time. You didn't have like a flock of sheep and a flock of goats. You had oftentimes they were together. And you know that they are very biologically, they're closely related. Some, I don't know if I could tell some apart. A sheep, obviously right before it's sheared, you can tell it's a sheep. But maybe your parents were sheep herders, and you know all about sheep and goats. But many of us, it would be hard they're not always easy to separate, to discern. So Jesus speaks about them being separated. All of the human race will be separated at the end. They will be pastured together. There comes a place of separation. And the sheep will be put on the right, which is the place of honor, the goats on the left. Poor goats, but this is the illustration, okay? The illustration Jesus used. Here's what will happen, verse 34. Then the king, first time Jesus uses this description of himself, the king will say to those on his right, "Come, you who are blessed by my Father. Take your inheritance." Now, I want you to pay attention to all these words because it's going to be important as we contrast them with what Jesus says to those on his left a little bit later. "Come, you who are blessed by my Father. Take your inheritance." In other words, what's yours, what you're entitled to, what has been designated for you to receive. The kingdom prepared for you since the creation of the world. It's been prepared for you. It's been waiting for you to receive it. And it's ready for you. Verse 35. "For I was hungry, and you gave me something to eat. I was thirsty, and you gave me something to drink. I was a stranger, and you invited me in. I needed clothes, and you clothed me. I was sick, and you looked after me. I was in prison, and you came to visit me." Now, this is a bit unexpected, but maybe not really. I mean, every ruler, every king, he honors those that honor him. I mean, if those political favors, you do for me, I do for you. If you do right, you get promoted. If you don't, you get demoted. I mean, and really, this is describing people who are in difficult places, hungry, thirsty, in prison, strangers. But it's not unprecedented that a king would actually emerge from that kind of a difficult place. I mean, there were kings and people who have risen to political prominence who were in prison. And so it would seem natural that a king would honor those who had honored him. Except there's something stunning and shocking about this example. Because these who honored the king, these who met his needs when he was in a difficult, desperate place, they didn't even know they were doing it. Their response, verse 37, when he continues, he says, "The righteous will answer him, 'Lord, when did we see you hungry and feed you, or thirsty and give you something to drink? When did we see you a stranger and invite you in, or needing clothes and clothe you?'" What are you talking about? I mean, it's great, yeah, but when did we do that? And here's Jesus' response. They continue, "When did we see you sick or in prison and go to visit you?" And the king will reply, "Truly I tell you, whatever you did for one of the least of these brothers and sisters of mine, you did for me." Whatever you did for one of the least of these. Now, Jesus uses the phrase, "brothers and sisters of mine." That term, the brethren, those are the family. That's oftentimes referring to those who are of the family of faith, fellow believers, those who belong to me, those who've trusted in me. Because as Matthew is writing this is literally what many of Jesus' followers were experiencing. They were being abandoned by their families. They were being persecuted. They were losing everything. Some of them were being imprisoned. And in that day, to be imprisoned meant that you had a good chance you would not come out alive. And if someone did not come visit you and bring you food and basic needs, you could starve to death. Okay, you would die in prison. This was happening to these brothers and sisters of mine, believers in Jesus. And listen, we're in 2018. This is still happening to a lot of brothers and sisters of His believers in other parts of the world. Whatever you did for one of the least of these, you did for me. He identifies with the rejected, with those who are in need, with the outcast, the poor. He identifies with them because He was one of them. He was rejected. He was outcast. He was poor. If you did it for them, you did it for me. Yay, sheep. Now, for those on the left, for those on his left, the goats. Then he will say to those on his left, I want you to compare this to what he said to those on his right. Depart from me, you who not are blessed, cursed. You who are cursed, into not the place prepared for you, but into the eternal fire prepared for the devil and his angels. For I was hungry, and you gave me nothing to eat. I was thirsty, and you gave me nothing to drink. Continuing verse 43. I was a stranger, and you did not invite me in. I needed clothes, and you did not clothe me. I was sick and in prison, and you did not look after me. So much easier when it was talking about the sheep. It would be so much nicer if he just left off right there. And they will answer the same way. Oh my gosh. Lord Jesus. How could we have missed you? When did we see you hungry or thirsty or a stranger or needing clothes or sick and in prison and did not help you? How could we have missed that? And Jesus' response, I tell you, whatever you did not do for one of the least of these, you did not do for me. See, it turns out that those who were turned out to be the real deal. And then Jesus speaks about a great separation. This is a sobering sentence, okay? A great separation with the entire human race before him, all the nations. Then they will go away to eternal punishment, but the righteous to eternal life. Now, I want you to think about it for a second, considering the words of Jesus and what we know about Jesus. We've already seen that Jesus has predicted that the temple in Jerusalem would be destroyed within a generation, and 40 years later, it happened. In fact, scholars struggle and debate over whether or not Matthew was written before 70 AD, and Luke, and even Mark, although almost all believe that Mark was written before 70 AD, because Jesus predicted the destruction of the temple. How could he have known that without being the real deal? So they say that it must have been after 70 AD. Jesus predicted the destruction of Jerusalem and the temple, and it happened. Jesus also predicted his own death and resurrection, and it happened. Not to mention that Jesus predicted that his movement, starting with him, a carpenter, a Jewish carpenter, with 12 disciples, one of whom turned out to be a traitor, the leader of whom denied him 3 times, who denied even knowing him on the day he was crucified. Jesus predicted this movement would go and cover the entire globe, that it would crisscross the earth and go to every corner of the earth. He predicted all those things, and it happened. This same Jesus, when speaking about the future, says that the future of every human being will lie in one of 2 places. That the entire human race will be separated into one of 2 destinations. So far, Jesus has been right about everything he's predicted. I don't think I would bet against his prediction of this destiny. This is a very serious matter. Because ultimately, talk is cheap, but actions speak. Talk is cheap, but actions speak. Not just with Jesus' actions that is predicting his predictions coming true, but with you and me as well. Talk is cheap, but actions speak. Now, if we could summarize this teaching of Matthew chapter 24 and 25, anytime you talk about Jesus teaching about the future and what the Bible teaches, there's all kind of curiosity. People want to get out their charts and they want to look and describe where do you fall, what do you believe, pre-trib, post-trib, mid-trib, amillennial, premillennial, postmillennial. How do you fit? What do you think about all of these things? And not just that, but how does world events today fit into what the Bible predicts? And there's all kind of different theories, and I've got some, and you can take them for what they're worth. But what Jesus does is what he does all the time. He makes it about you and us. He turns it back on us. Instead of being so concerned about signs of the future, pay attention to the needs of the present. Don't be concerned about predicting what you cannot know and what no one knows, that you miss what you can do something about. The needs of people in your midst today. Don't be so concerned with signs of the future that you miss the needs of the present. And a lot of people who are not attentive to this, they're not going to be happy when this comes to pass. Now, it's a bit comforting to me that in this teaching, which is jarring, there's no question about it, that when Jesus talks about those who are the sheep, those on his right, that they don't know that they have been doing this, okay? When Jesus says, when I was hungry and you gave me something to eat, I was thirsty, you gave me something to drink, I was in prison, you came to visit me. They don't say, yeah, you're welcome, you know? Like, of course we did. No, they're just as surprised. What did we do? We didn't know we were doing that for you. And besides, the sheep, they're not really worried about getting a pat on the back. That's not why they're doing it for. In their eyes, there's so much bigger need. There's so much more need than they can ever meet. They're more focused on the need than on getting box checked and being focused on everything that they've already done. And so it's comforting that they don't really know. And when Jesus describes them, and he says, then the righteous will answer him in verse 37, he's not saying that these are righteous because of what they do. Because they've done all these things, that makes them righteous. That's not what the Bible teaches. We're not righteous by anything that we do. We are righteous because Jesus is righteous, and by our trust in him, particularly in our trust in his death on our behalf, in his resurrection, that's what makes us right before God. So we're not righteous because we do these things or because they do these things. No, they do these things because they are righteous. That's what you do. It comes just as natural as breathing. You have received grace. You pay it forward. And so this teaching, which would be so easy just to kind of skip over. You know, let's talk about all the good things and all God's good promises. But as your pastor and someone who believes that Jesus is the real deal, and as someone who is responsible as a steward of the Word of God, and really someone who desires what's best for you and that you would be prepared for this day, believing that since Jesus predicted it, it's going to come to pass, it's worth asking ourselves. It's important to ask ourselves, what are you giving? What are you giving? See, the sheep in this parable gave something. I described it in this example. They gave something. I was hungry and you gave me something to eat. I was thirsty and you gave me something to drink. I needed clothes and you gave me clothes. What are you giving? Now, I don't know what the gross domestic product was of Judea and Jerusalem and Israel at that time, Galilee. I don't know what it was. Okay? I don't know what the median household income was. I don't know if the market was trending up or trending down. You know, in that day in Galilee and Judea, I don't know how things do. If people's standard of living were improvement or not. But I'll bet that their standard of living, their median household income was lower. It was lower than yours. So do you think that if they were expected to give, that Jesus would expect us more or less of us? What do you think? And that doesn't mean that all the time, that sometimes giving involves giving different things in different situations. We can let God sort all that out. But how we spend our money says a lot about what's important to us. What are you giving? And where are you serving? The people in this parable, this story, they came to the prison. I was sick and you came to visit me. They went somewhere. They were giving. They were serving others who were in need. Well, we're 4 days away from Thanksgiving. Christmas is coming up. It's a time where you hear a lot about giving, okay? And we got a new year not far away at all, 6 weeks, 7 weeks away, 2019. I wonder that in light of this teaching, and just in the light of the importance of this, that Jesus gives to us, that you could make it a priority, for you to make it a priority in your life, that you could make a difference in someone's life in 2019. Make a difference in someone's life. There's so many needs out there, okay? And sometimes we can become overwhelmed by the need. But the truth is, and I said this last week, is that you can't meet everyone's need, but you can meet someone's need. You can't be everywhere, but you can be somewhere. And you can't do everything, but you can do something. And sometimes, because we think I can't do that for everyone, we say, if I do it for them, then I'll have to do it for everybody. And as a result, what happens is we wind up doing so for nobody. Because we can't do it for everyone, we do so for no one. Well, if there's anything that this parable, this story teaches us, is the value of everyone. I was in prison. I was sick. You did it. If you did it for one of the least of these, you did it for me. Well, we're all waiting on God, right? All of us are waiting for something. There's a future that God has in store that only, Jesus says, only the Father knows. Maybe Jesus, the Son, now that He's at the right hand of the Father, maybe He knows too. But if He hasn't told me when it is, and if He's told you, I'm going to be skeptical, okay? I am, but maybe He has told you. But there are things that we're waiting for in our personal lives and maybe in the bigger story. And that we can't do anything about it. We're waiting on God. Well, we believe Jesus is coming again. It's true. He's coming back. But here's what this parable teaches us, and this is what's so important. Jesus is coming again. Jesus is here too. He's here. He's the hungry, the thirsty, the sick, those needing clothes, those in prison, the strangers. Jesus is here. And for those of us, for all of us who are trying to convince the world that Jesus is who He says He is, They're not going to probably pick up a Bible and read it. Maybe they will. They're going to believe Jesus is who he says he is because you are who you say you are if you're his followers. In other words, they'll believe he is the real deal because they see that we are the real deal. In the way that we give and serve and love other people, and not just those who can reward us with favors, the least of these. The power of the gospel of Jesus is given to us, but it's made effective for transformation when we receive it, when we embrace it, when we give it, when we share it. So, let's live it. Because ultimately, talk is cheap, but actions, they speak for all eternity.